Good morning, everybody. This is a live update. This is a live summary of the science mission collected inside Hurricane Laura. That includes the Windy Palms project of Mike Tice. That was just deployed right along the coast, just on the west side of Holly Beach. That was released yesterday, showing a max wind gust of 154 miles an hour, which we believe was right on the inside of a mesovortex whipping around the western Eyewall. And I also have the Subsonic Sensor data to share with you too. That includes the Barometer data, recording pressure fluctuations on the order of 15 times a second. And we also have Project MesoVort of the Radar Omega app. And here you can see that satellite imagery as Hurricane Laura was coming ashore, approaching just to the south. We were waiting up there in Lake Charles in that location. That's where we measured the northeastern Eyewall. We already had Project MesoVort deployed as well, right along the coast. And I wanted to do this update now that I've got full signal, just to go over some of that scientific data that we collected inside of the hurricane. And this again is that satellite loop that I showed you as it was approaching the coastline of southwestern Louisiana. Here's a still image from Radar Omega that shows our location right in the path of that storm, up near the radar site. And that measured 130 mile an hour wind up here just as the mesovortex was whipping through. This is one of the locations of the Radar Omega live sensors, and that was in Hackberry, Louisiana, one of the harder hit areas by that northern Eyewall, getting big time easterlies. And you can see some transverse banding as well inside the northern Eyewall. These are gravity waves, and these are one of the many features that we're trying to measure with the Subsonic Sensor and that microbarometer at a rate of 15 times a second. And the Windy Palms project was deployed right near the coastline, near Holly Beach. And look at all these little indentations, these nubs that are sticking out. That is definitely evidence of mesovortices that were ripping from north to south through the Windy Palms project there. And these bands here, or gravity waves, are largely responsible for that heartbeat that we talk about inside the hurricane. And that's what we're trying to measure with those very sensitive microphones that are within the Subsonic Sensor. And the Windy Palms project, as we mentioned, was deployed right down near Holly Beach. And we do believe that it sampled these mesovortices that were ripping by on the western side, causing that acceleration of the wind up above 154 miles an hour. Here you can see that the very dangerous right side of the storm came in well east of Cameron, and that's why the storm surge measurements have not been as prolific as we thought, at least on the Calcasieu channel out here. But areas off to the east were completely wiped out by that storm surge, likely 15 to 20 feet out there with the onshore flow and the dangerous right eye wall of that storm. And you can certainly see eddies that were spinning around inside the eye. And up near Lake Charles, there was actually a pressure measured of about 945 millibars in the center of the eye. We measured about 954 millibars in the eastern side of the eye just after experiencing that dangerous northeastern quadrant. And that pressure gradient within the large eye itself caused damaging winds to happen even within the eye wall. So there was no rain falling, perfectly dry conditions, and still getting gusty winds as these little eddies would spin around inside the eye. But that was the high resolution radar imagery from the Radar Omega app. And now I wanted to show you some Eyewall video that you have all seen already. And I'll let some of the audio play just so you can hear that audio inside the eye.
Hey, read, this building's coming apart with all the glass panels. They're getting blown through right now.
Go get to it.
And this was in the northeastern Eyewall, so this was in downtown Lake Charles. And the radar site out near the airport actually measured 130 mile per hour wind just before the anemometer and the radar were taken out. And that was likely those mesovortices that were spinning by our location, and the Subsonic Sensor that was just deployed just a couple of blocks off to the east of here. And we did measure a 5 millibar pressure pump, basically a push-pull action measured by the high resolution pressure sensor, and that was likely as a mesovortex was whipping by the subsonic sensor, triggering that pressure perturbation and also causing a bunch of damage through town, including a fire tower that was completely knocked over just about a block or two to the north of the subsonic sensor. But this was just as that eyewall was beginning to impact our location there. And we decided to intercept it in Lake Charles because this thing came in at night. We figured that we needed the lighting there in Lake Charles. We also wanted to measure those mesovortices inside and down near the marsh, a little bit closer to the coast in Cameron and Holly Beach. We believe that was in the death zone, and you really couldn't survive the hurricane down there unless you got completely lucky, and that's why we deploy those remote sensors like the Windy Palms project. I'm already trying to put together Mike Tice and Mark to try to see if we can get those live streaming so that then we can get that data recorded in real time. So even if the Windy Palms sensor is completely destroyed, we'll still be able to get that data back. And really we're trying to correlate data that was measured by the subsonic sensor, the microbarometer in there, the infrasound waves, and what was measured on our remote sensors like the Windy Palms project and Radar Omega's Project MesoVort. So here is the data that was measured by Mike Tice's Windy Palms probe, and it is an honor to have my name included on this data plot, even just for holding the ladder on deployment. But this was dreamed up by Mike. It's his dream project, and he had seen several hurricanes down in the tropics and noticed that the palm trees would always survive the most extreme winds of those most dangerous hurricanes. Even when anemometers or weather stations are completely wiped out, those palm trunks are largely left standing, and that's because they, through years and years of natural, well, centuries, even longer than that, they've developed those flexible trunks to be able to survive those very powerful winds due to the natural selection process. And so we utilized nature here to try to get an anemometer mast that would survive these extreme wind speeds, and that's exactly what happened with this deployment. Absolute perfect execution with Mike's idea, and this is going to be featured on our Category 6 series coming up on National Geographic in 2021. But here's that maximum wind gust of 154 miles an hour, and this is the 1 second wind gust data. And so that wind gust was just before the sensor entered in the very calm of the eye, and then the wind speed dropped down to near zero inside the calm of the eye. But we do believe that this was inside a mesovortex, as I'm going to show you correlated on radar. Maybe even the same mesovortex that went around the south side of the eye, then the east side of the eye, and eventually knifed through Lake Charles area as we measured with the subsonic sensor. But this is the barometric pressure data, and notice how it's falling inside the eye, eventually hitting a minimum of 945 millibars before leveling off. And you normally would expect that pressure data to go down, reaching a bottom right as the winds are near calm, and then lifting up in a symmetric fashion because this is basically a perfectly symmetric system, at least in terms of the isobars. But that didn't happen, and we do believe that the pressure sensor and the data logger pack was actually submerged by storm surge that came in off the water, probably 6 to 7 feet deep. The data logger, which is waterproofed, was about 5 feet above sea level, and it does look like right when it hit its minimum, it became submerged by storm surge flooding there in Holly Beach, and then that caused a slight rise when it should have been falling. And then as the pressure packs gradually equalized with the higher pressure on the outside of the pack, the lower pressure on the inside, you had more of a linear rise. So what this looks like is that the Windy Palms project, at least the data logger, was completely under probably 6 to 7 feet of storm surge flooding, and that the pressure likely went all the way down into the upper 930s or even down near 940 through extrapolation, reaching a minimum as those winds dipped down to calm and then ramped up in time for the back eyewall here. But just fascinating data showing what that sensor underwent, measuring those winds ramping up to about 154 miles an hour. The anemometer was sticking above the water out there, so just incredible that it worked. The concept worked flawlessly. Of course, there are some improvements that can be made. We could mount dozens of these Windy Palm sensors out ahead of the storm, make them live streaming. We're also considering some type of a smart ruler or smart meter stick that can actually measure the height of the storm surge flooding that is experienced by the sensor. and then that would tell us that right at this time that storm surge flooding arrived like a tsunami, enveloping the data logger box, which is completely waterproofed, causing an erroneous measurement of pressure when it should have been down near 940 or 938 millibars, and then afterward it rose with that anemometer sticking up above the water, still being able to measure the weaker back eyewall there. And here's a picture that I took of Mike recovering the sensor the next day there in Cameron Parish. And notice how vertical that mast is, perfectly straight up and down. Even though the trunk is a little bit angled, the perfectly vertical pole was by design to guarantee an accurate wind measurement. And you can see the anemometer that was sticking up above the storm surge flooding that came in here about 6 to 7 feet deep, working perfectly, sticking above the water, still measuring unimpeded wind measurements above that storm surge flooding, 6 to 7 feet deep with waves on top of it. Just an absolute miracle. But the meteorological data shows perfectly the journey that the Windy Palms project underwent and some of the most extreme conditions of Hurricane Laura. And here's some of that radar data that Mike put together, showing the location of the Windy Palms project there, right in the inner eastern eyewall. And notice these transverse bands, these gravity waves that are in the northern eyewall. And these are creating those micro perturbations in pressure that the subsonic sensor is designed to measure. Waves like this, gravity waves that are traveling longer distance, infrasound waves that are capable of traveling over 300 kilometers away from their source. That's what we're trying to measure with those very sensitive microphones inside the subsonic sensor that was deployed up here in Lake Charles in the damaging northeastern eyewall of this storm. But also this radar image confirms the presence of mesovortices in the western eyewall. You can see these little kinks, almost hook-like features, hook-like appendages on the western side of the eyewall. And just before the Windy Palm sensor entered into the calm of the western eye there, measuring a pressure, likely experiencing a pressure near 940 or in those upper 930s, but measuring a 945 millibar pressure just before it became submerged with storm surge flooding. But we do believe that it was one of these mesovortices that impacted the sensor directly, and that became one of the first sensors to ever sample one of those mesovortices and surviving. And was the concept of the Windy Palms project. So now I wanted to show you some of the data collected by the Subsonic Sensor. And again, thank you, Facebook supporters, for making all these projects possible. This is the Subsonic Sensor just after we collected it, after it experienced the back eye wall of that storm. This was developed by Mark, Chase and Spin on Twitter. And there you can see it in all its glory, the very sensitive microphones in there, and the sensitive microbarometer capable of measuring those pressure perturbations on the order of 15 times a second. So that's why it's capable of measuring those pressure push and pulls inside of a mesovortex. So now I'm going to show you the video, and this infrasound data was sped up 137 times to give you an idea of what it sounded like. And you got to listen for that click just as the mesovortex passed very near the subsonic sensor, and that click represents that 5 millibar push-pull action, which is substantial, and that's what was registered and picked up by the very sensitive microphones here on the subsonic sensor. And here's some of the damage that we saw. This is one of the radio towers that was completely twisted. There is evidence of vorticity from a mesovortex. And this was just about a block or two north of the subsonic sensor, just as that click went by. Is likely when this fire tower was down. It's normally over 140 meters tall. And there you can see just chopped off right at its base with some twisting evidenced there in the damage survey. And now I'm going to play this once again and decrease my volume so that you can hear the click passing by indicated on radar. And again, that was sped up about 137 times. from the infrasound data to show you audio-wise what that mesovortex sounded like in terms of the pressure sensor as it whipped by. And again, there's some of that damage that we saw as well. And here's some video of that tower damage, raw video, showing the twisting motion. And this tower was over 140 meters tall, about a block or two north of where the infrasound sensor was deployed. And that mesovortex knifed through downtown Lake Charles, causing extreme damage, especially on the eastern side of Lake Charles, even coming through downtown, possibly contributing to that damage in the Capital One building downstream. But damage like this is widespread throughout Lake Charles, and that's why we're trying to raise money through the Team Dominator t-shirt sales. We're trying to get a truckload of supplies ourselves, but if we can't make that happen, we're going to contribute all our resources to groups that are already down there helping out in the recovery effort. But this damage was extensive. It reminded me a lot of Panama City after Michael went through, just extensive urban damage caused by a major hurricane moving through. In this case, it was a Category 4 storm. And a lot of mesovortices inside as that hurricane was interacting with the friction of the earth, disrupting the force balance and causing cross-isobaric flow and the spin-up of those eddies on the inner gradient of that eyewall. And again, here's the location that we deployed the subsonic sensor. We were looking for a stable, stable structure that also we could find a sheltered location, so we were trying to deploy the subsonic sensor on the downstream side of that structure. And this was the location where we deployed it. It was actually on the southwestern side of the building. So initially, on the downwind side of the front eyewall, we were measuring a much more untainted pressure signal, untainted infrasound data. And then as the back eyewall came in, the infrasound started to experience some wind, and that caused a little bit of a masking of that signal. Ideally, we want to deploy the subsonic sensor in perfectly calm winds, and that way the infrasound signature is not masked by those very strong winds that are impacting the sensor, and that's why we selected this building. We also wanted to pick a building that was sufficiently small that didn't have an infrasound signature of itself, maybe some machinery on the inside or something. All of that can be measured by the very sensitive microphones of the subsonic sensor. And you can see that our building was actually de-roofed. So part of the roof was lifted off right next to the sensor and set down right in the backyard, or right in the front parking lot of this gas station. And again, that tower was just a couple of blocks off to the north that was downed by the mesovortex that went through. And so this is that fine data, the microbarometer data of the subsonic sensor. And one thing to note is this perturbation right there that really stands out. And that's that click that I just showed you in the video. That's the 5 millibar push-pull action that happened in the western eyewall. And interestingly, that pressure dropped all the way down to the minimum experienced in the eastern eyewall, which is about 954 millibars. The pressure actually dropped to close to 956 in the western eyewall as that tornado-like vortex passed through. And then the subsonic sensor entered the eye, the eastern part of the eye, and there was still a pressure gradient in there, so we were experiencing damaging winds even in the eastern side of the eye. And then we had a minimum pressure of 954 millibars. But the pressure actually got down to about 945 millibars just west, on the west side of Lake Charles, out near the Sulphur area, closer to the middle of the eye. And that's also likely part of the pressure that the Windy Palms project sampled, that lower pressure just in the western semicircle of the eye. But this is that fine scale microbarometer data measured at a rate of 15 times a second. And notice how it becomes more noisy inside the eye and also the back eye wall. And that's because the wind was directly impacting the subsonic sensor after that. So you have to do some more filtering to pull that infrasound signature out of that data. So zooming in on that mesovortex, or that 5 millibar pressure pump that we talk about as the mesovortex went by, you can really see the signature, the decrease, the pressure fall as the mesovortex was approaching, and then the dramatic pressure rise, or almost an overcompensation of the atmosphere, miniature sloshing effect as that mesovortex passed by. And this minimum right here, as I mentioned, is as low as the minimum pressure that we measured inside the eye. So that's pretty close to 955 millibars, and that was well within the northeastern eyewall, or the most powerful eyewall of this hurricane, just before we intercepted the eye. But you can definitely see that 5 millibar push-pull action there in this very high-resolution data, the Subsonic Sensor designed by Chase and Spin. And you can see all of these perturbations as well. That's sampling the pressure oscillations from those transverse bands, or those gravity waves that are inside the northern eyewall that I just showed you on radar. And you can see these smaller scale oscillations in there moving by with those gravity waves. And so this research is beneficial because we can see if these signatures are repeatable. So we'll see if there are more approaching mesovortices that are on the way, potentially causing damage inside the eyewall. We can get more advanced lead times when we learn of this heartbeat inside the storm and correlate them to certain impactful features that we observe inside. And so that's definitely one thing that can happen from the subsonic data. And here is the raw infrasound data plot showing that microbarometer data with time, applying some time filters on that as well. And you can see how it became still more noisy in the middle of the eye, as it was quite turbulent, getting some winds that were impacting the subsonic sensor directly. And then with those southwesterly winds coming in on the back side of the eye, that's why you have this more noisy configuration in the second half of the data set, likely masking a lot of the infrasound signal that's in there. But with this deployed in the front eyewall, relatively sheltered by the deployment location that we found, we were able to find a couple of these big pressure pumps inside the eye as that mesovortex passed through. But this is the raw data, and it does require some post-processing, but this is basically like a heart rate monitor of Hurricane Laura as it was coming in, showing those mesovortices, gravity waves inside, infrasound waves that are capable of traveling much longer distance. And we're going to be using this technology to measure data in and around tornadic supercells to learn the difference between a supercell without a tornado on the ground, a supercell with tornadoes, or a hurricane eyewall with the presence of mesovortices inside, and maybe those that don't have mesovortices. So really we're just scratching the surface with this data. And this is the Hydrometer data, and this is actually collected inside Tropical Storm Marco, which came ashore with about 40-mile-an-hour winds, you may remember. That was preceding everything. And that data was measured, showing the warm rain processes here inside the outer bands of Marco. And one thing that you'll notice when we deploy this inside a supercell in the mid-latitudes is you'll notice the presence of hail, or a secondary peak, which basically shows that there's a big distribution of raindrop sizes in supercell storms in the mid-latitudes. You get the smaller raindrops like you observe in a tropical system, but you also get bigger raindrops, and that's as hailstones or grapple will melt, and that creates bigger drops, and then they coalesce, and that widens the distribution of hydrometeors even more. But differently in tropical systems where you have less hail, you have what's called warm rain processes, where you have a relatively uniform raindrop size. And here we're talking about 2 to 3 millimeter hydrometeor size. That's where most of them were located, but a pretty narrow peak in the hydrometeor size, showing that the processes were dominated by very warm rain processes and having very small raindrop sizes. So that's what we're looking at with Hurricane Laura. That's a summary of our data. This is a high-resolution satellite image that shows the eye that was approaching from the south of Category 4 Hurricane Laura with maximum sustained winds indicated by Hurricane Hunter aircraft of 150 miles an hour. The green dots there on the radar Omega satellite imagery are Project MesoVort. Those are the live streaming packs that were deployed, and 101 mile per hour wind was recorded there in Hackberry before that was knocked offline and hit by debris, and the electronics were taken out. The Sabine Pass there was far west of the inner core of the hurricane, but this network of recording stations is only going to expand as we move forward. So eventually we'll have dozens of these sensors, Windy Palms, MesoVort, and the Subsonic Sensor, measuring all of this data at the same time. We'll have a network of the subsonic sensors. That way we can record that more easily. But really a success in terms of the science mission, just getting off the ground, and we've got a long way to go monitoring these storms in real time and the conditions as they deteriorate, and better understanding the complex meteorology inside this new breed of storm that seems to be impacting the U.S. even that much more frequently. And now I'm going to leave you with the Eyewall video here. I'm going to decrease my audio, then you can hear some of the audible sounds inside of this hurricane. And I wanted to thank you guys for your support. I'm going to take the comments here on the Facebook supporter portal. And I hope you guys enjoy my weather reports. And thank you so much for making this groundbreaking science possible. If it weren't for the Facebook supporter community, we wouldn't be doing any of this. We'd have no live streams, no live reports, no educational briefings afterward. So thank you everybody for being a part of the team. And I hope you enjoyed the live stream inside the northeastern eyewall of powerful Hurricane Laura.
Hey, read, this building's coming apart with all the glass panels. They're getting blown through right now.
Go get to it. I'm gonna point into it.
Back up?
Sheet metal. It's coming our way because we're in that path. Just go back like 100 yards and you can pull right back into that thing. Keep going, less than 100 yards. Keep going.